I'm Papi Flex. I make daily OpenFront content, and this is my ultimate factory guide. The guide will cover everything from beginner basics to advanced strategy and tactics. I recommend watching all of it. To compile this guide, I have spent many hours playing real OpenFront games, testing in custom lobbies, and researching the factory code. Any mistakes, corrections, or changes to the guide will be reflected in the pinned comment down below. Let's get into it. Briefly, how do factories work? Factories are one of the economic structures in OpenFront. If connected to a rail line, it will periodically spawn a train, and when placed, it can create rail lines to cities, ports, and factories within its range. How do trains work? Trains are how factories generate gold. Every game tick, there's a chance to spawn a train from any of your factories. The more factories you have, the higher the chance. If a train spawns, it will pick any station that it is connected to by rail. No matter the distance, the train will then travel the shortest rail path to that station. Any stations on the rail line, including the final one, give an equal amount of gold to the owner of the station and the owner of the train. This also means that you can make money from other people's trains if you have stations along a rail line that another player's train passes through, since the gold is mutually given. A station can be a city or a port placed on a rail line. A factory can also be placed on a rail line, but it does not act as a station. Stacked cities and ports placed on a rail line only count as a single station node. Okay, that's the definitions covered. Now you probably want to know, how much money do you make from your trains passing through a station? Teammate and unallied players' stations produce 25k gold. Allied player stations produce 35k gold, and your own stations produce 5k gold, which is effectively 10k as you're the owner of the train and the station. After a train has passed through 10 stations, subsequent stations will give 5k less gold for each station per benefitter with a set minimum of 5k gold. For beginners, I recommend placing factories right on your borders with allies or teammates, but avoid placing multiple separate factories in the same border area unless they're stacked. In the advanced segment, I will explain the rationale behind this. Placing a factory, city, or port within the range of a factory and not on an existing rail line will create a new rail line. As a rule of thumb, you want to create a single straight line with up to 7 to 10 stations before creating new rail lines. Again, I will dive deeper into this later in the guide. Also note, rail lines can cross thin riverways. Carefully place stations directly on lines near allies or teammates' factories and between your border factories, creating a single rail line. When hovered, you will see the line glow green, indicating the station will be built on the line. As the game progresses, you will notice some lines with more train traffic. These are likely the shortest paths that many trains will converge on. Fill those lines with cities. If you can place ports on existing rail lines, do so to double down on economic value. Finally, be careful not to misplace or create extra rail lines. Stacking factories is especially great when next to a reliable ally, and it is even better if it doesn't link at all to your cities for 10 or more stations. Make sure you never stack a factory that exclusively outputs into your own stations. So when should you use factories? Of course when you are landlocked, but factories are strongest with multiple nearby players and a medium territory size. You'll make more money if you are between more players. Ideally, you have at least 3 neighbors also building factories. Do not use factories on a small to medium sized island, it's not optimal. If you have a corner spawn or the distance between your allies is really far, starting with factories will be slower. In this case, it's best to stack the factories near an ally and avoid linking a rail line from your own factory to your own structures until mid game. Occasionally, you can still connect your stations directly to their factory. Can I build both? In the early game, it is not wise to split between income sources because boat trade rewards you for having more ports than other players. If you are port maxing, having 1 or 2 factories to connect into rail networks is fine. In the late game, you want to have both ports and factories in equal amounts, transitioning to port maxing by hyper late game. Creating long networks away from other players is bad because trains take the shortest route. These new lines and stations won't get a lot of traffic from the network and require connector factories that end up mostly spawning trains into your own stations, which is very inefficient. Building factories that can only link up one or two new stations doesn't add many nodes to the network and is generally inefficient. Make sure if you develop new lines, you can afford to build multiple stations on them. Maintenance is often overlooked. When bombed, you need to manually repair your high traffic rail lines. Fix it as soon as possible. Accidentally placing a city port or factory near existing tracks, creating a mess of the rail lines, which divides train traffic. Be very careful of this in the early to mid game. In general, creating loops or grid like rail networks creates too many lines. It is just expensive at best and at worst reduces your total income. They are often too short to fully populate with stations, and the new lines that are closely parallel to existing stations don't count as connected, and there isn't enough space to build on them. The last thing I want to cover in the beginner section of the guide is an early game setup which you can adapt for your own matches. There are also more examples on my YouTube gameplays as I often go factories over ports. So the first thing you need to do is have a rough plan based on where you choose to spawn. We're looking for potential trade choke points and how many nearby players there are. Taking 5 seconds before the game starts to have a rough plan means you can easier focus on the early game and potentially know where your first infrastructure will be placed. In this example, I'm choosing a fairly open spawn, but I'm confident I can cut off players against a small lake, which should force them to build factories and create a natural choke point for lots of train traffic to route around it. Now that we have expanded and have the gold for our first city, we want to decide where to place it, making sure it's safely away from players that will be able to attack us, but still able to connect. You can always hover a factory to double check. I see some of my neighbors having placed their city already. That's a good indication that I want to be allies with them. I'm confident that I can kill enough tribes to get two cities and a factory, so I will get my two cities first and then connect them. Having a high troop cap early will make it more likely people ally me, which is very important for a strong early game. We can delay our econ to ensure this. I'm also trying to section off the territory required for the choke point because it will pay dividends in the mid game. I decided to go for an extended line setup as I'm quite big, placing my second city close to other players who are likely to build factories which will connect it. This setup will require multiple factories to eventually connect, so it's a bit slower economy early. Deciding how to place your first factory is fairly easy. If you have a large territory, place it where it will connect to the most allied stations. If you are more compact, place it so that it creates a line from one to two of your stations to at least one allied station. And in the case someone already has a factory connecting to one of your stations, build your factory on the other side, extending the line through your territory, making a single line and connecting to another ally. As you can see, I have placed one of my cities too far to connect. Our goal is to create a single line through the center of our base and fully populate it with stations. Don't try and be fancy with it. If you have a lot of nearby allies and want to create a second line, make sure it connects into the center of your main line so that trains travel through multiple stations. Most importantly, please avoid placing structures in a way that creates a mess of lines. Doing this introduces shorter paths that will skip the stations, which really hinders your economy in the early to mid game. If your allies aren't building factories near you, you can remind them by holding the Alt key, left clicking on them, and sending them the factory emoji. My last rule of thumb for the early game, as you conquer other players and entrust new allies, be sure to connect up to them if they already have an established rail line. Once again, aiming for the simplest line possible. That wraps up the beginner basics. If you found this guide useful so far, share this video with your friends, and consider tossing me a sub. Now we'll move on to the advanced strategy and tactics. I think that we should start off with an easy but important question. What are the pros and cons of factories versus ports? This way we establish a baseline of the variables involved for when you may want to employ and use factories and how it may dictate your playstyle. As a caveat, currently they are quite balanced overall, so don't feel obligated to use one over the other until you hit later hyper late game and need to use both. Ease of use. Factories are harder to utilize, requiring more game knowledge to use them properly. Mid-game, this is eased by more connecting lines for cities and stabilized allies, but still require attention, whereas ports have very little to think about outside of pirating and requiring water access. You just set it and forget it. Complexity. Factories have complex mechanics at all points in the game. Developing multiple high traffic lines in the mid game can be especially challenging. By comparison, ports have very few mechanics to consider outside of just building more. Potential. Factories can really take off early to mid game. If all the stars align, you can get ahead in economy while building up a high troop cap. However, later in the game, factories and lines inevitably become less optimal. On the other hand, ports are harder to get an advantage early unless you pirate trade, which is both expensive and risky if you aren't already strong. Port's potential increases as the game goes on. Gaining a port count advantage versus other players enables you to receive a larger share of the trade ship gold and can be done from any position. Variability. Factories require multiple early nearby allies, ideally building factories as well. Ports can be even worse early, especially if other players deploy warships and your trade ship takes a long route. In the mid game, factories are very consistent. Train lines are fully developed in most places and allies are established. Later in the mid to late game, waterways become more reliable. Pirates are mostly banished and rail networks begin to become inefficient with no way to fix them. Consistency. Factories provide small but semi-frequent bits of income early. Ports, on the other hand, give large chunks of gold more infrequently. Sometimes you just need 50k gold and you have to wait for gold regen before being able to build, only to have a boat come shortly after with 200k. Factories have the consistency advantage until the late game when you have enough boats trading at one time. Defendability. Factories innately have less appeal to be pushed or bombed. If someone captures a factory off you early, it doesn't really affect your income. It can even boost it if you can build another cheap factory. Going the factory route also means you will likely have more cities and therefore a higher troop cap early. However, as bombs become more prevalent later into the mid to late game, your rail lines are very hard to defend and contain many cities which are easier targets for both bombs and players. Ports are only weaker early because the players are able to boat into them. By mid game, the ability to deploy a warship, spread them out, or stack under a high level SAM make them far superior for defending. Comeback potential. If you stack 20 factories, it is in the other player's best interest to ally you. If you stack 20 ports, it's in the other player's best interest to take them. Plus, ports scale better when you aren't behind. Control. If you stop trading with a player, manually or by fighting them, rail lines through that player are cut off, limiting your trade very heavily, especially early with so few lines and trading partners. Even worse, it still includes those factories within the train spawning function code, so it can heavily reduce your total train output if it exclusively links to an embargoed player. Ports are more automated comparatively, but the trade embargo feature works better with ports as you still spawn the same amount of trade ships. Coupled with the ability to fully control waterways, ports give players more control at every stage of the game overall. It is worth mentioning, factories have the capability to be stacked right next to an ally away from other rail lines to force trade exclusively through them. This allows you to mutually trade with a weaker player, avoiding any severe downsides. A very powerful strategy, but somewhat niche. Versatility. Factory setups flourish with certain spawn conditions, but synergize really well with general game progression into the mid to late game with established networks and the ability to build more cities or transition into ports. Plus, it doesn't demand a lot of factory investment. Ports really require you to keep up with your port count relative to other players, and while it can economically outscale, especially if you're snowballing, it is more restrictive on your structure expenses. No matter what, you will often be building cities and ports on available rail lines mid to late game, so this really only applies to the early game. Perceived threat. An underrated consideration. OpenFront is a game of relationships, and early factories on borders is seen positively, while early warships are viewed negatively. Being friendly overall is a better tactic. Later, players will often ignore factory count and focus on port count, especially if stalemated, which will draw a lot of attention. Populating bodies of water with warships is more visible than where you've stacked your factories or which lines you're stealing train trade from. Overall, a lot of this comes down to experience, play style, and preference. In my opinion, factories are better early to mid game if you know what you're doing. Ports are better late to hyper late game, but both are fine choices. Choose one to max until you get to late game, and then you should diversify. Okay, now that we've gotten through the spreadsheet, let's move on to the math. Just quickly, let's go through the train spawning formula and then we'll examine some more interesting factory tactics and mechanics. We can see from this data calculation that each time you invest into an additional factory, the marginal improvement is less and less comparatively to each prior factory you have. Therefore, the more factories you build, the longer it will take to make a return on your investment. Factories are strong, but they scale with player count and placement more than individual total factory count. Hypothetically, a player with 4 factories spawning trains directly into exactly 10 allied stations makes 350k every 5 seconds, which is roughly equivalent to the income a player with 1,000 factories that spawn exactly into 10 of their own cities. We can extrapolate some theoretical pivot points from this. If most of your factories are internal rather than on borders, your network is unoptimized and you should expect reduced income. Consider focusing on that. If you're snowballing and have captured 20 plus factories, you should begin port maxing. And if you port maxed first, in the late game, start stacking a few factories on pixels where they'll path into other players. You've decided to go factories, but how many should you build at each stage of the game? Aim for 2 to 3 in the early game, use the discounts up no matter what, your first 3 factories are very efficient. Get up to between 3 to 7 in the mid game, you need to build them if you aren't capturing them. In the late game, you want around 7 to 20, keeping in mind that you're taking factories from other players that they've built, and those additional factories that you build should be placed on borders and rarely to maintain important lines. Otherwise, avoid spam placing them. If you reach hyper late game, stacks of 10 directly into each viable ally is good. Beyond that, you should be transitioning to port trade for sure. Everyone still watching, congrats, you made it to the most complicated and important section of this guide, Advanced Rail Network Design. This section will thoroughly detail how to design, create, and upgrade rail networks throughout all stages of the game. As covered in the beginner section, you want to be planning from pre-spawn. You need to think about what area do you plan to control the rail networks through? How many players are likely to build factories and border you? You want at least 3. Where will most train stations be concentrated relative to you? Which directional bias should you plan your first rail line on? Are you likely to have enough tribes for 2 cities and 1 factory, or only 1 city and 1 factory? Let's discuss early game rail line templates. The best setup is one straight line across your territory, creating an efficient route. You have 1 to 2 factories on opposite borders, linking your pre-placed cities and spawning into allied stations. It's often better to have the line more central, but not practical to execute every game. A good setup is one corner line. It's not the best scaling because there isn't space for 10 cities in the mid game. The other option is creating a 3-way line with a single factory in the center connected to 2 to 3 allied factories. This is a bit slower income at the start, but scales well. A bad setup occurs when a line is highly irregular instead of straight, reducing likelihood of it being the most efficient route for trains, or if the route gets spliced, siphoning trains off your line and trains that travel through have already passed through multiple stations before it gets to yours. A very bad setup is not being able to establish a proper line, or if your spawn is far from where most traffic will flow through, but you still have 1 to 2 factories pumping into a nearby rail line with at least 3 stations on it. And the worst setup is if you don't connect to any stations aside from your own. You're effectively cooked. All of this takes practice, especially where you place your city in accordance to the line you want to make, close enough to the border to encourage allies to build factories, but not so close that you become a tempting target. If you manage a 2 city start, you have to line them up with your predicted rail line. There's also dealing with loops and redundant lines caused by others, and acquiring the game sense to know how it impacts your lines. Which brings us to the mid game. The mid game is slightly more straightforward. Start by filling out your original line with cities. If you need to build a new line, link it between 2 allied border factories in a new section of your territory. Ideally, these lines won't require you to build a factory to connect them. You can also link from a single ally's factory to the center of your already populated rail line. As you expand, you may inherit factories and lines which render your original line less effective because you've captured the factories that were spawning into it. This is unavoidable. Now that the game is starting to stabilize, you need to reassess where most of the trains are generated from, moving towards, and populate those lines with cities. You also need to choose allies you won't be attacking anytime soon, either because they are strong or you've sectioned them off from others being able to attack them, aka a mitochondria. In the mid to late game, try to only build additional factories if they can't route into your own cities for roughly 10 stations. Continuing on to the late game, utilizing factory trade becomes simplified. At this point, we only care about trains spawned next to us. Other trains traveling across the map are likely only giving 5k gold when they come through our lines. Hopefully you've boated around and found some pixels on players that you don't naturally border with. If you have less than 50 total factories, you can offer them an alliance and build a 10 stack of factories next to them. When you get bombed and it breaks a highly profitable line, fix it as soon as possible. Otherwise, no need for more factories. You want to diversify and start getting your port count up for the optimal economy. You can still create new lines directly from factories you border with, but don't worry about extending them across your entire territory, just connect them to an existing internal line, even if it's messy or makes a loop. As you exit late game and enter hyper late game, you should be completely done building factories and fully swapped to port maxing. Your line should have enough cities, so spread out your new cities away from enemy silos or stack them in a bunker. That is more practical to defend it with the final fight coming. Whew, I'm sure you're getting antsy. We're over 20 minutes. I just have a few more points and niche tactics to cover. It wouldn't be an ultimate guide if I skipped anything. Sometimes a sign of careless placement, but if they occur, you should prioritize placing stations which cover both lines, especially on intersections. It's worth mentioning here again. If a new parallel track is created beside a line you already have cities on, most of those cities aren't considered on that new line. They have to be placed afterwards when it shows both lines glowing green. Spreading can be more tactical to avoid bombing, while stacking can be optimal to maximize economy. I should also note there is a 1 second cooldown after trains spawn from a factory entity or node. Don't worry about it. It barely affects your income assuming you followed my guide, just don't stack individual factory entities above 20. I have two placement optimization tricks. Starting with manipulating factory range. You can actually connect two factories that don't have an overlap without using another factory between. The game has a piece of code that allows the nodes to quote unquote extend the range. Normal factory range is 110 tiles, but the code gives in-range connected nodes within 45 tiles of another in-range connected node the ability to link rails. This is about 40% further than a single factory's range and allows you to fit more cities. You can also manipulate the normal number of cities that fit on lines. This is what I call zippering, where you alternate sides to fit slightly more cities on a single line. Mitochondria, or even just a singular mitochondrion, are very strong. Sometimes you can force players into this role if you landlock them against an edge, or fully surround them. Just don't forget to re-ally and watch out for the betrayal risk. This is so powerful because no one else is getting the trade from that player, giving you an economic edge versus opponents, and that mitochondria can be kept small to reduce the threat that they pose to you. With factories, you need to be really careful of trade embargoing. This can happen when either player attacks the other, or if they manually stop trading. Any lines connecting to a node within the embargoed player will be removed from the train spawn pool, as if the node and the entire line didn't exist. If a lot of your lines go through the player you aren't trading with and don't have a way around, you will notice your income drop significantly. If you have many factories that only connect to a non-viable trade partner, they remain in the spawn pool check but will not spawn a train. You can see why this is very detrimental if you think back to the train spawning function. You can mitigate the risk by having multiple bordering allies and port diversification in the late game. If you want to remove an erroneous line, you can place a city or port on the rail, then either bomb or delete the structure. This removes the section of the track that connected to it. Rarely this can be worth the 1 mil or so it costs. You should also delete large stacks of 20 plus factories if they always hit 10 of your own stations first. This will give your better placed factories a higher chance to spawn a train and actually increase your income. Plan ahead in the early to mid game. Always be thinking about the optimal line or extension and analyzing the nearby lines. Only splice into allied factories. Trying to siphon traffic from a city line is less optimal and can backfire. Having a high number of connected stations and or being between more players and therefore trade paths. Repair reaction speed after being bombed and knowing which lines are worth repairing ahead of time. Centralizing track nodes to avoid other players creating shortcuts from your line. General trade flow and min-max placing factories on the outflow side early to avoid self-trade. Realistic early line ambitions. Every game is different. Adapt. Early city placement aligned with map access or trade bias, not territory shape. Avoid only stacking factories into players who are a threat to you. Diversify. Placing stations as soon as you have the gold, especially early or after alliance renewals. Start swapping to ports once you reach 20 total plus factories. Avoid building more than 10 border factories until late game. 10 factories is a great sweet spot where you can solely focus on cities and bombs. Not every game is a factory game. You need 3 plus allies who will build factories, and it's best to either have a choke point or a more central spawn. Improve your early game first. It's the most impactful. Then, master the mid game. And finally, ascend to an endgame expert. I'd like to end with a prayer, if you'd bow your head. May the rail line connect to link you. May the factories be always on your borders. May the cities line straight along your tracks, the trains flowing through your stations. Until we trade again, may factory maxing give you the win. That's it. My ultimate factory guide. Listen, just quickly, this guide took me a little over 2 hours for every minute of playtime. There are over 200 pieces of content I had to create from scratch, alongside a 5,000 word script, and then editing it all together. I did everything manually, no AI. So if you found this guide helpful, I would really appreciate it if you could interact with my content in any way. You can like, comment, subscribe, share with a friend, anything. Thanks. Papi Flex out.